Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we grab some pretty dense, often challenging source material, and we really break it down for you, give you that shortcut to being genuinely informed.
And today we're diving into something particularly heavy. It's a source that, well, it claims to lay out this hidden playbook, a systematic marketing plan.
Right, a plan it says was used by groups the source labels as radicals, elitists, and pseudo-experts, the goal, to really transform American culture and law.
That's the core claim. So our mission today is to dissect this supposed playbook. We're looking at how the source argues these huge shifts in American values weren't just drift, not just organic change.
No, exactly. But the result of like a coordinated strategy. We're talking about how the source says moral issues got reframed deliberately as constitutional rights.
And how quoting certain traditional moral texts, like the Bible in some contexts, could somehow become defined as hate speech. That's a major shift being analyzed here.
It really is. So the main document we're digging into, the author calls it the marketing of evil.
And the central idea is that these very professional PR campaigns were designed, quite intentionally, the source argues, to make evil appear good and good appear evil.
Which is a really stark claim.
It is. And the stated objective, according to the source, was to push towards what it calls a culture of death. So, provocative stuff.
Definitely provocative. And the things we're going to unpack, they're challenging for sure, but, maybe vital for understanding where things are today. We're going to look at the claim of a PR strategy that weaponized the AIDS crisis.
Yeah, using it for political gain. And then there's this specific Supreme Court ruling. The source claims just fabricated this rigid idea of separating church and state.
Fabricated is a strong word. We'll also dig into the science or pseudoscience that allegedly launched the sexual revolution.
Right. The source points fingers at specific figures in research, and also how big corporations might be involved in creating destructive youth archetypes, the Mook, for example.
We'll define that later. And then we tie it all into what the source calls the media matrix, this mechanism that supposedly keeps these illusions going, keeps the public kind of trapped in a manufactured view.
It's a lot to cover.
It is. And hey, if you want to follow the evidence chains, the deep dive in real time, maybe get some extra docs, follow @official Urbanus on X. Okay, let's get into it. This blueprint, this alleged cultural subversion, where does the source say it started?
Okay, so the source material argues this wasn't just some random uprising. It points to a very specific starting point for the strategic planning of the modern movement.
When and where?
February 1988, that's the date given. There was this gathering, they apparently called it a war conference, in Warrenton, Virginia.
A war conference.
That's the term used in the source, yeah. And it brought together representatives from 175 leading homosexual activist groups.
Wow, 175. That's serious coordination.
Oh, absolutely. The source presents this as a deliberate, high-level strategy session focused entirely on mapping out their PR and legal future.
Okay, so not just protests and rallies. This was about a playbook.
Exactly. And the output wasn't some fiery manifesto. It was this detailed public relations blueprint. It was eventually codified in a book called After the Ball: How America Will Conquer Its Fear and Hatred of Gays in the 90s.
After the Ball. Okay. And who wrote it? Not just activists off the street, I gather.
No, the source makes a point of this. The authors were Marshall Kirk and Hunter Madsen, highly credentialed guys. Kirk, Harvard-educated, a neuropsychiatry researcher.
Okay.
And Madsen, also Harvard, a doctorate, an expert in public persuasion and social marketing tactics. These were, as the source puts it, smart guys, not just passionate activists.
So they knew about shaping public perception.
That was their expertise. And their book, After the Ball, became, well, the source calls it the PR Bible for the movement.
And what was the goal stated in that book? The source must quote it.
It does. And it's presented as very cold and strategic. The aim was, and I'm quoting loosely from the source's reference here, to force acceptance of homosexual culture into the mainstream, to silence opposition, and ultimately to convert American society.
Force acceptance. Silence opposition. Convert society. That's blunt.
Extremely blunt. And the source also highlights something particularly cynical, it argues, about how the AIDS crisis was viewed.
How so?
Well, the claim is they didn't just see it as a terrible tragedy. They saw it, strategically, as a window of opportunity, a chance, maybe a brief one, to frame themselves as a victimized minority.
Leveraging the crisis.
Leveraging the crisis to gain sympathy and protection. The strategic question they reportedly asked was, how can we maximize the sympathy and minimize the fear? That's from Kirk and Madsen, according to the source.
Maximize sympathy, minimize fear. Okay, so how did they plan to do that? What was the actual strategy outlined?
It was laid out, according to marketing expert Paul Rondeau cited in the source, in 3 stages. A very methodical approach.
3 stages, okay.
Desensitize, jam, and convert. That was the sequence.
Desensitize, jam, convert. Seems almost military.
Well, remember the war conference framing. The source explicitly compares this 3-stage process to something out of Orwell's 1984, arguing its success relied totally on unabashed propaganda.
Unabashed propaganda. Okay, let's break down those stages. Stage 1, desensitize. What did that involve?
Desensitization, according to the source's analysis of Kirk and Madsen, was about normalization through visibility. Just flooding the public square, the media, with talk about homosexuality.
Making it common, familiar.
Exactly. Presenting it in non-threatening ways. Think positive portrayals of the friendly gay neighbor, the competent gay professional. Lots and lots of talk, making the topic seem commonplace, even boring eventually.
So just sheer volume of exposure.
Volume and tone control. The source points out this stage required suppressing negative associations. So avoiding any talk about, say, the behaviors that straight people might find offensive or health statistics that might cause fear. Keep it positive, keep it ubiquitous.
Got it. Okay, stage 2, jamming. That sounds aggressive.
It's presented as the defensive and offensive maneuver. Jamming is about controlling the narrative by, well, jamming the signals of opposition.
Hello.
By immediately and loudly associating any dissenting voice or moral critique with hatred and bigotry. The strategy described is to paint critics as homophobes, irrational haters.
The labeling tactic?
Precisely. The source quotes Kirk and Madsen suggesting tactics like publicly smearing perceived enemies and associating them with repulsive figures or ideas. The goal is to make the critic look so bad that their message is instantly discredited, regardless of its substance.
So it shuts down debate.
It aims to shut it down instantly.
Yeah.
Make the social cost of disagreeing seem too high. Create this chilling effect where people are afraid to voice traditional views for fear of being labeled a bigot.
That's the structuring the consciousness idea the source mentioned. Basically managing what people feel comfortable saying or even thinking.
Right. And the force claims Kirk and Madsen were surprisingly open about the ethics of this, or maybe the lack thereof. There's a quote highlighted where they apparently state it makes no difference that the ads are lies.
Wow, they actually said that.
That's the claim in the source. Their justification, reportedly, was that they were fighting fire with fire. They argue they were countering existing negative stereotypes that are every bit as much lies and far more wicked ones.
So the ends justify the means. Lying is okay if it counters what they see as worse lies.
That seems to be the rationalization presented. It's this idea of using calculated deception propaganda as an ethical tool to fight perceived prejudice.
Okay, so desensitize, jam. What's the final stage? Convert.
Conversion is the end game. It's about embedding the new view so deeply that it becomes the accepted reality. The goal here, specifically, was to solidify the idea that homosexuality is innate, unchosen, like being left-handed.
Why was that specific point so crucial?
Because, as Kirk and Madsen reportedly argued, if homosexuality isn't seen as innate, if it's seen as a choice or behavior, then it opens the door to talking about moral choices and sin.
Okay. So framing it as natural takes morality out of the equation.
Exactly. It shifts the entire conversation from a moral debate to a civil rights issue. If it's natural, like race or gender, then society must accept and protect it. It cannot legislate against it or morally condemn it. That reframing was key to the conversion stage.
So the whole 3-stage process, according to the source, was a deliberate campaign to fundamentally change not just laws, but how people think and feel about the issue using propaganda and narrative control.
That's the argument being made, yes. A very detailed, conscious strategy.
Okay, let's pivot slightly. The source also talks about another major lever used in this alleged transformation, judicial activism, specifically around the idea of separation of church and state.
Right. The source calls the modern interpretation of a rigid constitutional separation of church and state one of the biggest, most outrageous, malignant, and provably false big lies of our time.
That's quite a claim, because that separation idea is pretty much bedrock legal thinking now, isn't it? It leads to removing prayers from schools, crosses from public land.
It is bedrock now. But the source argues vehemently that this current understanding, this absolute wall, is completely disconnected from what the Founding Fathers actually intended.
Okay, so what was the original intent, according to this analysis?
If you look back at the 1789 debates about the First Amendment, particularly the Establishment Clause.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion.
Right. James Madison's goal, the source contends, was very specific: to prevent the federal government from establishing a national church, like the Church of England, which was taxpayer-funded and mandatory in Britain. They didn't want Congress picking one denomination and making it the official religion of the United States.
So it was about preventing a national church, not about banning God from public life entirely.
That's the argument. It wasn't about creating a godless public square. It was about protecting religious freedom from federal interference. The source uses the metaphor of protecting the garden, meaning the church, from the wilderness, meaning the government.
Keep the government out of the church's business, basically.
Exactly. And the source points out the historical context. The same Congress that passed the First Amendment also opened sessions with prayer, appointed chaplains, approved the national motto, "In God We Trust," later. They clearly didn't see a contradiction. They didn't intend to ban all public acknowledgement of God.
Okay, so if that was the original intent, where did this idea of a high, impregnable wall come from? The source must pinpoint a moment.
It does. It points directly to a Supreme Court decision in 1947. The case was Everson v. Board of Education.
Everson.
This is described as the cataclysmic judicial shift. Justice Hugo Black wrote the majority opinion, and in it, he introduced this phrase, this new legal doctrine. The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable.
He just declared it. Where did he get that wall language from? Was it in the Constitution?
No, not in the Constitution itself. The source highlights the irony. Black pulled that wall phrase from a private letter written by Thomas Jefferson in 1802.
A private letter.
Yes, a letter Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptists in Connecticut, basically reassuring them that the federal government wouldn't interfere with their religious practice. It was a metaphor in a personal letter.
And Justice Black turned that metaphor into constitutional law nearly 150 years later.
That's the claim. The source adds context about Black himself, noting his past membership in the KKK and alleged anti-Catholic biases, suggesting he seized on Jefferson's phrase to fundamentally reinterpret the First Amendment and apply it against the states via the 14th Amendment.
Wow. So a single justice, using a phrase from a private letter, basically rewrote the relationship between religion and state in America.
According to this source, yes. That Everson decision became the precedent, the foundation for decades of subsequent rulings that systematically scrubbed religious references from public institutions.
That's a huge claim about judicial power. And the source apparently draws parallels to other major decisions, suggesting personal factors can heavily influence rulings. It mentions Roe v. Wade.
It does. It delves into the circumstances around Justice Harry Blackmun writing the majority opinion for Roe in 1973.
What does it claim influenced him?
Well, it cites accounts, including from Blackmun's own daughter, Sally, that he actively consulted his wife and daughters for their opinions while drafting the decision.
Okay. And is there more context?
Yes. The source provides some sensitive background. It mentions that Sally Blackmun, years earlier, as a 19-year-old college student, had become pregnant out of wedlock. She apparently left college, and the source suggests this experience caused significant personal turmoil and trauma for the Blackmun family. It also notes Sally later became chairwoman of Planned Parenthood of Greater Orlando.
So the implication is that this personal family history might have swayed his legal judgment on abortion?
That's the explosive suggestion the source makes. That a decision impacting millions of lives might have been influenced not just by constitutional law, but by personal whims, emotions, and family traumas. It raises a deeply uncomfortable question about how landmark rulings are sometimes made if this account is accurate.
It certainly does. And the downstream effects of these judicial shifts, especially the Everson wall, the source gives examples of how far it's gone.
Oh, yeah. It mentions one specific case, citing chapter and page, about a public cemetery.
What happened there?
A federal court apparently ordered the removal of a cross-shaped flower planter from the cemetery grounds.
A flower planter? Why?
The reasoning given, according to the source, was that the mere sight of the cross might cause emotional distress to a non-Christian person who happened to pass by. And this potential distress was deemed injury in fact, legally speaking.
So the possibility of someone feeling offended trumped the religious expression.
That's how the source presents it. A complete inversion, it argues, where religion, once protected, is now framed as potentially harmful, and needing to be hidden away to protect others' feelings.
Okay, so we've got the alleged propaganda strategy and the judicial shifts. What about the cultural side? The source mentioned the sexual revolution and fraudulent science.
Right. The argument here is that if you're going to dismantle traditional moral and religious constraints, you need some kind of scientific or intellectual justification for the new freedom.
And that's where Alfred Kinsey comes in.
Exactly. The source identifies Alfred C. Kinsey as the key figure providing that foundation. But it doesn't paint a flattering picture. It refers to his biographer revealing him as a, quote, sexual psychopath.
Whoa. Okay, strong language again. But his research, the Kinsey reports, they were hugely influential, weren't they?
Massively influential. They essentially launched the modern era of sexual freedom, choice, and prioritizing consensual relationships above all else. But the source claims the whole thing was built on sand.
How so? What were the flaws in his research, according to this document?
Major methodological flaws. The biggest one cited is his sample group. It wasn't representative of the general population at all.
Who did he interview then?
Apparently, his data relied heavily on interviews with convicted sex offenders, prisoners, and members of various sexual undergrounds. These are groups with obviously atypical sexual histories and behaviors.
So you can't generalize from them to everyone else?
Absolutely not from a statistical standpoint. But the source claims Kinsey did exactly that, presenting his findings as reflective of mainstream American sexuality.
And the source mentions even darker aspects of his work.
Yes. It goes into some disturbing territory, citing his biographer again. It claims Kinsey took a disturbing interest in and even rejoiced at accounts of pedophiles conducting horrific sexual experiments on hundreds of children. It frames these as Joseph Mengele-like experiments.
That's incredibly disturbing. If true, that completely undermines his credibility.
It certainly raises profound questions about the origins of the data. The source presents this as the deeply flawed, even pathological, foundation upon which much of the sexual revolution's science was built.
Were these flaws known at the time? Did anyone challenge him?
There were critics, yes. Statisticians pointed out the sampling bias almost immediately. People like Abraham Maslow raised concerns. But the cultural impact was so immense, and perhaps the message was so appealing to many, that the criticisms didn't really stop the momentum.
So the flawed data took root anyway?
It seems so. And here's the kicker, according to the source. Despite these well-documented flaws and the deeply disturbing background, Kinsey's research is still cited as authoritative today.
Still, after all that?
Apparently, yes. The source notes it's been referenced thousands of times, like around 6,000 times in major citation indices. It continues to influence legal arguments about things like hate crimes, child custody, same-sex marriage.
That's incredible.
And maybe the most chilling detail the source provides is that NAMBLA,
the North American Man-Boy Love Association.
Yes. They apparently cite Kinsey as their scientific standard bearer, using his flawed data to try and normalize intergenerational sex.
Okay, so that connects back to the earlier point about needing homosexuality to be seen as natural. Kinsey's flawed data helped achieve that.
That's the argument. The source references Kirk and Madsen again, stating they knew it was crucial to establish that homosexuality wasn't a choice.
Right.
Because if it's not a choice, if it's innate like Kinsey's skewed data suggested, then you can't attach moral choices and sin to it.
It removes the basis for moral critique.
Precisely. It reframes it entirely as an identity, not a behavior. The source concludes that this scientific basis was essentially manufactured propaganda, but it succeeded in achieving legal and cultural dominance.
Okay, so if the science provided the justification, how was this new culture of limitless freedom actually sold, especially to young people? The source talks about a youth pipeline.
Yeah, this section argues that major corporations aren't just responding to youth culture, they're actively creating it, often in destructive ways, for profit.
How do they do that?
The source claims big media conglomerates. It names Viacom, Disney, Time Warner, as examples employ what it calls culture spies, or undercover agents.
Culture spies, what do they do?
Their job is apparently to infiltrate teen social scenes, malls, parties, online spaces, and study young people like, quote, laboratory rats.
To figure out what's cool.
Not just figure it out, but to anticipate and even engineer the next big trends, especially the shocking ones. The source quotes an NYU professor, Mark Crispin Miller, who argues that in the fierce competition for attention, companies deliberately drag standards down because shock sells quickly.
So they're not reflecting youth culture, they're manipulating it for profit.
That's the core accusation. And out of this process, the source claims come deliberately manufactured, often amoral, role models, specific archetypes designed for maximum impact and profit.
Like the Mook and the Midriff you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Let's define those based on the source. The Mook is presented as the manufactured male role model. Loud, crude, obsessed with sex, aggressively immature, defying all authority. Think shock jocks or certain reality TV stars.
Okay, I can picture that. And the Midriff.
The female equivalent, according to the source. Hypersexualized from a young age, often portrayed as aggressive or calculating, her value derived almost entirely from her appearance and her defiant attitude.
And corporations deliberately create and push these figures.
The source uses Viacom and Howard Stern as a prime example. It says Viacom crowned Stern, the original and still king of all mooks, and then amplified his persona across all their platforms, radio, TV via CBS, books via Simon & Schuster, movies via Paramount.
So cross-platform promotion of a manufactured archetype?
Exactly. The argument is these aren't just entertainers. They're calculated products designed to lower cultural standards and generate massive revenue by appealing to base instincts.
And this leads young people towards what?
Towards self-destructive behaviors, the source argues. Things that seem rebellious or forbidden, but are actually being packaged and sold as authentic or even spiritual experiences. It taps into what the source calls an ageless spirit of defiant paganism.
Rebellion packaged as spirituality. Can you give some examples? The source mentioned some extreme ones.
It does, to illustrate how fair the boundaries are pushed. The first one is incredibly dark. Bug chasing?
Bug chasing? What is that?
It's described as an online subculture where some men actively seek to get infected with HIV.
Seek it out? Why?
The source quotes a journalist, Gregory A. Freeman, who reported on this. For the adherents, the bug chasers, intentionally getting infected is seen as the ultimate taboo, the most extreme sex act left on the planet. The forbidden nature itself provides the thrill, the identity.
That's deeply disturbing. And the other example, suspension.
Yes, the practice of suspending the human body from large hooks pierced through the skin.
That sounds like torture.
To an outsider, yes. But the source points out that people who practice it often describe it as a profound spiritual experience. It cites a body modification publication where proponents explain that dramatically altering the body can trigger a larger freeing on a spiritual level.
So extreme physical acts reinterpreted as spiritual liberation. How does the source connect this back to the corporate influence?
It links it to the idea of glorifying dysfunction. It references a psychotherapist, Stephen Levenkron, who worked with self-mutilators. He found that for many, physical pain can become a way to cope with unbearable emotional pain, rage, shame.
A physical release for emotional turmoil.
Right. And the source argues that when the culture, driven by corporate interests, celebrates these extreme self-destructive acts as authentic or spiritual, it actually prevents people from dealing with the underlying issues. It gives them a sense of belonging and validation for the dysfunction, which ultimately just serves the system selling the rebellion aesthetic.
So it traps them rather than freeing them.
That's the argument. It relieves the inner conflict by validating the destructive impulse, but leads to deeper misery in the long run.
Okay, let's bring this into the modern day. How does the source claim this system, this media matrix, keeps operating now?
Well, the first point is about media bias. The source contends that the mainstream establishment press leans significantly to the left of the average American. And coupled with that, it alleges a significant presence within media of individuals aligned with the agendas discussed earlier, particularly the homosexual rights movement. The result, it claims, is that traditional Christian or conservative viewpoints are routinely framed not as legitimate perspectives, but simply as bigotry.
So the media itself enforces the jamming tactic we talked about.
That's essentially the argument. It shapes the bounds of acceptable discourse. And this bias isn't just on social issues. The source claims it extends to foreign policy, too.
How so?
It argues the press often perpetuates what it calls modern-day myths, specifically citing the Palestinian cause as an example often maintained through staged events or street theater.
Street theater? Like fake protests?
Potentially, yes. The most prominent example the source dives into is the case of Mohammed al-Dura.
Oh, I remember that image. The boy supposedly killed in his father's arms during a shootout in Gaza. It went everywhere.
Exactly. September 30, 2000. That image became iconic, a rallying cry for the Second Intifada, portraying Israeli brutality.
But the source says it was staged.
It claims independent investigations, citing people like Gerard Huber and analyzing the raw footage, found inconsistencies, suggesting it was faked.
What kind of inconsistencies?
Things like allegedly incongruous battle scenes caught on camera nearby, eyewitness accounts reported in the source of supposedly wounded people getting up and walking away when they thought the cameras weren't rolling. People falling off stretchers, then hopping back on.
Wow. If that's true, that's a major media manipulation.
The source presents it as a prime example of how emotionally charged, potentially fabricated narratives can be used to shape public opinion and foreign policy, overriding factual investigation.
Okay, staying with media bias, the source brings up the Catholic Church sex abuse scandal, the pedophile priests scandal, as the media universally called it.
Right. And the source is clear. The media was right to condemn the church for covering up horrific abuse and protecting offenders. That's inexcusable.
There's a nuance the source claims was missed or ignored.
Yes. The nuance is in the term pedophile priests. Pedophilia technically refers to attraction to prepubescent children. But the source asserts, citing researchers like Stephen Rubino, that the vast majority of the victims in the Catholic scandal, maybe 85%, were actually teenage boys.
So is mostly abusive adolescent males, not young children.
Largely, yes. Which means the abuse was often pederasty, committed by predatory men, many of whom identified as homosexual, abusing their power over vulnerable teenage boys.
So why did the media stick with the pedophile label?
The source suggests it was a deliberate mislabeling, perhaps subconscious, perhaps strategic. It argues the media operated in a schizophrenic manner.
Ow.
On one hand, they rightly condemn the church for the actions of these predatory men hurting boys, but at the same time, many media outlets were championing the cause to force organizations like the Boy Scouts of America to accept openly homosexual leaders.
The contradiction.
Yeah.
Condemning the outcome in one institution while promoting the alleged cause in another?
That's the double standard the source highlights. It claims that by using the less specific, more emotionally charged term pedophile, the media deflected attention from the specific issue of homosexual men abusing boys within the church, thus protecting the broader gay rights agenda from negative association.
And simultaneously used the scandal to attack traditional groups like the Scouts for upholding standards that might have prevented such abuse.
Exactly. It's presented as a case study in selective framing and outrage, used strategically to advance one agenda while damaging institutions that resist it.
Okay, this playbook seems to culminate, according to the source, in the campaign to legalize abortion. This is presented as the ultimate example of strategic deception.
It is. And here, the source leans heavily on the confessions of someone who was on the inside, Dr. Bernard Nathanson.
Who was he?
He was a co-founder of NARAL, the National Abortion Rights Action League, originally the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws. He was one of their chief strategists in the early days.
And he later confessed. What?
He later became pro-life and wrote extensively about the tactics they used. He confessed, according to the source, that the entire campaign for legalization was built on deliberate lies and fabricated data.
Fabricated data? Like what?
Two key things he admitted to fabricating. First, public support. Nathanson reportedly confessed they simply fabricated the results of fictional polls. They just announced to the media that surveys showed 60% of Americans wanted abortion legalized.
Even though that wasn't true.
He claimed they knew a real poll would show the opposite, but they needed to create a sense of inevitable momentum. Make politicians think public opinion was already on their side.
The self-fulfilling lie, as he called it. What was the second fabrication?
The number of illegal abortions. This was crucial for creating public panic and sympathy. Nathanson admitted the real number of deaths from illegal abortions was probably closer to 200 to 50 per year, and the number of procedures around 100,000.
Well, what number did they feed the media?
They consistently used the figure of 1 million illegal abortions per year and 5,000 to 10,000 deaths. Dramatically inflated numbers. Nathanson explicitly called this a fabrication used to build public pressure for legalization.
Just made up numbers to scare the public and lawmakers.
That's Nathanson's confession, as reported in the source. Lying about deaths, lying about procedures, lying about public support, all strategically deployed.
And beyond the fake data, how did they frame the issue itself?
This is where the PR firms came in, according to the source. They were masterful at shifting the focus away from the fetus, away from the morality of the act itself, by framing it entirely around choice and who decides. Should a woman have the right to choose? Should the government be involved in personal decisions? These slogans were politically brilliant because they resonated with American values of autonomy.
So it bypassed the uncomfortable question of what abortion actually is.
Completely diverted attention from it, the source argues. It became a debate about women's rights and privacy, not about the life of the unborn.
And this marketing extended right down to the clinic level.
Oh, yes. The source includes testimony from former abortion clinic workers like Carol Everett and Nita Witten.
What did they reveal?
They described being trained, not by counselors, but by professional marketing directors. Their job wasn't to counsel women on options. It was explicitly how to sell abortions over the telephone.
Sell abortions. Like a product.
Exactly like a product. Witten explained the technique. Identify the woman's biggest fear, parents finding out, money problems, the boyfriend leaving, and then magnify that fear relentlessly.
To make abortion seem like the only solution.
Yes, to convince her quickly that abortion was the necessary answer to your problems. The goal was to hook the sale on that first call before she had time to think, talk to others, or consider alternatives like adoption.
So pressure selling based on fear.
A relentless marketing process designed to close the deal, according to these testimonies.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, the source presents a picture not of random cultural shifts, but of a deliberate, multi-pronged strategy.
A cohesive strategy, yeah. A real-world matrix, the source calls it, designed by certain groups, elites, activists, pseudo-experts, to reshape society.
And the claimed goal is, what? Leading people away from conscience into bondage.
That's the interpretation. Leading people towards choices and lifestyles that ultimately harm them by redefining good and evil, right and wrong. The ultimate danger highlighted is losing the very ability to tell the difference.
Let's do a quick recap of the main bombshell claims from the source we looked at today.
Okay, rapid fire. 1. The alleged 3-stage propaganda plan, desensitize, jam, convert used to mainstream homosexuality, driven by the idea that lying in ads was acceptable.
2. The claim that the rigid separation of church and state doctrine is a judicial fabrication from 1947, based on a misinterpretation of a private letter, not the Constitution's intent.
3. The assertion that the sexual revolution's scientific basis rests on fraudulent research by Alfred Kinsey involving disturbed methodologies and subjects is still cited as authoritative.
4. The accusation that corporations use culture spies to manufacture destructive youth archetypes like the Mook and Midriff, monetizing rebellion, and even extreme acts like bug chasing.
And 5. The confession attributed to NARAL co-founder Bernard Nathanson that the abortion rights movement used fabricated poll data and massively inflated statistics about illegal abortions to achieve legalization.
It's a lot to take in. And the source leaves us with a challenge, doesn't it? It asks why people might be drawn to these destructive things if the analysis is right.
Yeah, the suggestion is that glorifying dysfunction can feel validating. It can temporarily relieve inner conflict or shame by making the destructive urge seem normal or even rebellious and cool, but ultimately, it argues, it leads to misery.
And the source proposes that true compassion isn't enabling this, but what was the phrase?
Patient but firm opposition to the lie, gently but clearly upholding a standard of truth and health.
So the final question the source seems to pose to you, the listener, is pretty direct. If this framework is even partly true, if there is a kind of matrix trying to sell you destructive ideas packaged as freedom.
Are you strong enough to see it? And are you strong enough to resist it, even when it seems like everyone else is buying in, when the culture, the media, maybe even the law celebrates it?
That's the challenge. If you want to dig deeper into the evidence, the citations, all the gritty details from the source material, you can subscribe at theofficialurban.substack.com.
And we genuinely want to know your take on these claims. Are they convincing? Outrageous? What did we miss? Thread your thoughts on X using #UrbanOdysseyTruth and reply to @officialurbanus. Let's keep the conversation going.